Tracing the history of any nation backwards into the past, we come at last to a period of myth and tradition, which eventually fade away into impenetrable darkness. In some cases, as in that of Greece, the historic period goes back to 1000 BCE, while in the case of Egypt, the contemporaneous records recently unearthed from ancient tombs and monuments carry back that history up to about 5000 BCE or greater. But in either case, the historic period, the oldest limit of which may be taken to be 5000 or 6000 BCE, is preceded by a period of myth and tradition. And as these were the only materials available for the study of prehistoric man up to the middle of the 19th century, various attempts were made to systematicize these myths, to explain them rationally, and see if they shed any light on the early history of man. But, as observed by Professor Max Mueller, it was felt by all unprejudiced scholars that none of the systems of interpretation was in the least satisfactory. The first impulse to a new consideration of the mythological problem, observes the same learned author, came from the study of comparative philology. Through the discovery of the ancient language and sacred books of India, discovery which Professor Mueller compares with the discovery of a new world, and through the discovery of the intimate relationship between Sanskrit and Zend on one hand, and the languages of the principal races of Europe on the other, a complete revolution took place in the views commonly entertained in the ancient history of the world. It was perceived that the languages of the principal European nations, ancient and modern, bore a close resemblance to the languages spoken by the Brahmins of India and the followers of Zoroaster, and from this affinity of the Indo-Germanic languages, it followed inevitably that all of these languages must be offshoots or dialects of a single primitive tongue, and the assumption of such a primitive language further implied the existence of a primitive people. The study of Vedic literature and classical Sanskrit by Western scholars thus gradually effected a revolution in their ideas regarding the history and culture of man in ancient times. Dr. Schrader, in his work on the prehistoric antiquities of the Aryan peoples, gives an exhaustive summary of the conclusions that they arrived at by the methods of comparative philology regarding the primitive culture of the people, and those that desire to have further information on the subject should refer to that interesting book. For our present purposes, it is sufficient to state that comparative mythologists and philologists were in the sole possession of the field, until the researches of the later half of the 19th century placed within our reach new materials for the study of man not only in prehistoric times, but in such remote ages that compared with them, the prehistoric period appears to be quite recent. The mythologists carried on their researches at a time when man was believed to be post-glacial, and when the physical and geographical surroundings of ancient man were assumed not to have been materially different from those of the present day. All ancient myths were therefore interpreted to the assumption that they were formed and developed in countries, the climatic or other conditions of which varied very little, if at all, from those which we are now surrounded. Thus, every Vedic myth or legend was explained either on the storm or the dawn theory, though in some cases it was felt the explanation was not all that satisfactory. Indra was only a storm god, and Vitra the demon of drought and darkness brought on by the daily setting of the sun. This system of interpretation was first put forward by Indian entomologists, and though it has been improved upon by Western Vedic scholars, it is yet remained practically unchanged in character. It was again believed that we must look for some original home of this race somewhere in Central Asia, and that the Vedic hymns, which were supposed to be composed after the separation of the Indian people from the common stock, contained the ideas only of that branch of the race which lived in the temperate zone. The scientific researches of the latter half of the 19th century have, however, given a rude shock to these theories, for hundreds of stone and bronze implements have been found buried in various places in Europe, which archaeologists have now established a chronological sequence to the Iron, Bronze, and Stone Age in times preceding the historic period. But the most important event in the latter half of the 19th century, so far as it concerns our subject, was the discovery of the evidence proving the existence of the glacial period at the close of the Quaternary era, and the high antiquity of man, who was shown to have lived not only through the Quaternary, but also in the Tertiary era, when the climatic conditions of the globe were quite different from those of the present, or the post-glacial period. The remains of animal and men found in the Neolithic or Paleolithic strata also threw into new light the ancient races inhabiting the countries where these remains were found, and it soon became evident that the time telescope set up by the mythologists must be adjusted to a wider range, and the results previously arrived at by study of myth and legends must be checked with the light of facts disclosed by scientific discoveries. The philologists had now to be more cautious in formulating their views, and some of them soon realized the force of the arguments advanced on the strength of the scientific discoveries. The works of German scholars like Porsche and Penka freely challenged the Asiatic theory regarding the original home of the ancient race, and it is now generally recognized that we must give up that theory and seek for the original home of the ancients somewhere else in the further north. Canon Taylor, in his Origin of the Aryans, has summed it up with work done in the last years in this direction. It was mainly a destructive work, and concludes in his book that the observation that the tyranny of the Sanskritists is happily overpassed, and it is seen the hasty philological deductions require to be systematically checked by the conclusions of prehistoric archaeology, cranial knowledge, anthropology, geology, and common sense. Had that remark not been used as a peroration at the end of the book, it would certainly be open to the objective that unnecessarily deprecates the labors of the comparative mythologists and philologists. In every department of human knowledge, old conclusions have always been revised in the light of new discoveries. But for that reason, it would never be just to find fault with those whose lot it was to work earlier in the same field with scanty and insufficient materials. But whilst the conclusions of the philologists and mythologists are thus being revised in the light of scientific discoveries, an equally important work yet remains to be done. It's been stated above that the discovery of the Vedic literature imparted a fresh impulse in the study of myth and legend. But the Vedas themselves, which admittedly form the oldest records of the ancient race, are as yet imperfectly understood. They had already grown unintelligible to a certain extent, even in the days of the Brahmins several centuries before Christ. And, had it not been for the labors of the Indian entomologists and grammarians, they would have remained a sealed book up to the present time. The Western scholars have indeed developed, to a certain extent, these native methods of interpretation, with the aid of facts brought to light by comparative philology and mythology, but no entomological or philological analysis can help us in thoroughly understanding a passage which contains ideas and sentiments foreign or unfamiliar to us. This is one of the principal difficulties of Vedic interpretation. The storm, or the dawn theory, may help us in understanding some of the legends in this ancient book. But there are passages which, in spite of their simple diction, are quite unintelligible on any of these theories. And in such cases, native scholars, like Sayanya, are either content with simply paraphrasing the words, or have recourse to distortion of words and phrases in order to make the passages yield a sense intelligible to them, while some of the Western scholars are apt to regard such texts as corrupt or imperfect. In either case, however, it is undoubted fact that some Vedic texts are yet unintelligible, and therefore untranslatable. Professor Max Mueller was fully alive to these difficulties. As he observed in his introduction to the translation of the Vedic hymns and the sacred books of the East series, a translation of the Rig Veda is a task for the next century, and the only duty of the present scholars is to reduce the untranslatable portion to a narrower and narrower limit, as has been done by Yaska and other native scholars. But if the scientific discoveries of the last century have thrown new light on history and culture of man in primitive times, we may well expect to find in them a new key to the interpretation of Vedic myths and passages, which admittedly preserve for us the oldest beliefs of the ancient race. If man existed before the last glacial period and witnessed the gigantic changes which brought on the Ice Age, it is not unnatural to expect that a reference, howsoever concealed and distant, to these events would be found in the oldest traditionary beliefs and memories of mankind. Dr. Warren, in his interesting and highly suggestive work, Paradise Found, or the Cradle of Human Race at the North Pole, has attempted to interpret ancient myths and legends in the light of modern scientific discoveries, and has come to the conclusion that the original home of the whole human race must be sought for in the regions near the North Pole. Our objection is not so comprehensive, and we intend to confine ourselves only to the Vedic literature, and show that if we read some of the passages in the Veda, which have hitherto been considered incomprehensible, in the light of new scientific discoveries, we're forced to the conclusion that the home of the ancestors of the Vedic people was somewhere near the North Pole, before the last glacial epoch. The task is not an easy one, considering the fact that the Vedic passages, on which we rely, had to be, and have been, hitherto either ignored or explained away somehow, or misinterpreted one way or another by native and European scholars alike. But we hope to show that these interpretations, though they have been provisionally accepted, are not satisfactory, and new discoveries of archaeology and geology and science provide us with a better key for the interpretation of these passages. Thus, if some of the conclusions of the mythologist and the philologist are overthrown by these discoveries, they have rendered a still greater service by furnishing us with a better key for the interpretation of the most ancient legends. And the results obtained by using the new key cannot, in their turn, fail to throw further light on the primitive history of the ancient race, and thus supplement or modify the conclusion now arrived at by the archaeologist and the geologist. But before proceeding to discuss the Vedic texts which point out to this polar home, it is necessary to briefly state the results of discoveries in archaeology, geology, and paleontology. The summary must necessarily be short, for we propose to note down only such facts as will establish the probability of the theory from the geological and paleontological point of view for this purpose. We've freely drawn upon the works of other well-known writers such as Lyell, Geikie, Evans, Lubbock, Kroll, Taylor, and others. We've utilized the excellent popular summary of the latest results of these researches in Samuel Lang's Human Origins and other works. The belief that man is post-glacial and the polar regions were never suited for human habitation still lingers in some quarters, and to those who still hold this view, any theory regarding the polar home of an ancient race may naturally seem to be a priori impossible. It's better, therefore, to begin with a short statement of the latest scientific conclusions, these points. Human race of earlier times have left ample evidence of their existence on the surface of this globe. But like the records of the historic period, this evidence does not consist of stately tombs and pyramids, inscriptions, or documents. It is of humbler kind and consists of hundreds and thousands of rude or polished instruments of stone and metal recently dug out from old camps, fortifications, burial grounds, tumuli, temples, lake dwellings, and etc. of the early times spread over the whole of Europe. And in the hands of the archaeologist, these have been found to give the same results as the hieroglyphs in the hands of the Egyptologist. These early implements of stone and metal were not previously unknown, but they had not attracted much notice of scientific experts until recently, and the peasants in Asia and Europe, when they found them in their fields, could hardly make any better use of them than that of worshipping the implements so found, as thunderbolts or fairy arrows shot down from the sky. But now, after careful study of these remains, archaeologists have come to the conclusion that these implements, whose human origin is now undoubtedly established, can be classified into those of stone, which includes horn, wood, or bone, those of bronze, and those of iron, representing the three different stages of civilization in the progress of man in prehistoric times. Thus, the implements of stone, wood, or bone, such as chisels, scrapers, arrowheads, hatchets, daggers, and etc., were used when the use of metal was yet unknown, and they were gradually supplanted first by implements of bronze, and then of iron, when ancient man discovered the use of these metals. It is not to be supposed, however, that these three different periods of early human civilization are divided by any hard or fast line of division. They represent only a rough classification, the passage from one period to another being slow and gradual. Thus, implements of stone must have continued to be used for a long time after the use of bronze became known to ancient man, and the same thing must have occurred as he passed from Bronze to Iron Age. The Age of Bronze, which is a compound of copper and tin in definite proportions, requires an antecedent age of copper, but sufficient evidence has not been found to provide separate existence of copper and tin age, and hence it is considered probable that the art of making bronze was not invented in Europe, but was introduced there from other countries, either by commerce or by Indo-European race going there from outside. Another fact which requires to be noted in connection with these ages is that the Stone or the Bronze Age in one country was not necessarily synchronous with the same age in another country. Thus, we may find a high state of civilization, say, in Egypt, about 6000 BCE, when the inhabitants of Europe were in the early stages of the Stone Age. Similarly, Greece had advanced to the Iron Age while Italy was still in the Bronze period, and the west of Europe in the Age of Stone. This shows that the progress of civilization was slow in some and rapid in other places, the rate of progress varying according to the local circumstances of each place. Broadly speaking, however, the three periods of stone, bronze, and iron may be taken to represent the three stages of civilization anterior to the historic period. Of these three different ages, the oldest, or the Stone Age, is further divided into the Paleolithic and the Neolithic period, or the Old and New Stone Age. The distinction is based on the fact that the stone implements of the Paleolithic age are found to be very rudely fashioned, being merely chipped into shape, never ground or polished, as is the case with implements in the New Stone Age. Another characteristic of the Paleolithic period is that the implements of the period are found in places which plainly show a much greater antiquity than can be assigned to the remains of the Neolithic age, the relics of the two ages being hardly, if ever, found together. The distinction between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic age is that the remains of Paleolithic man are found associated with those of many great mammals, such as the cave bear, the mammoth, and the woolly-haired rhinoceros that became either locally or wholly extinct before the appearance of the Neolithic man on the stage. In short, there is a kind of hiatus or break between the Paleolithic and Neolithic man, requiring separate classification and treatment for each. It may also be noted that the climatic conditions and the distribution of land and water in the Paleolithic period were different from those of the Neolithic period. While from the beginning of the Neolithic period, the modern conditions, both geographical and climatic, have prevailed almost unaltered up to the present time. To understand the relation of these three ages within the geological periods which history of the Earth is divided, we must briefly consider geological classifications.